This is the last topic that we're going to be discussing in our first unit. And there's a reason why I've decided to put it at the end of the unit. And that's because everything that we've been looking at so far, more specifically with Descartes and Locke and Berkeley and the contemporary scientific worldview, all of that stuff has a direct bearing on whether or not you think free will exists. So we're going to revisit some of those ideas today. And I hope to trace Strawson's argument in the lecture, and then hopefully we can all kind of have a discussion about it and see what you all think. So today we're looking at a piece written by Galen Strawson, who is the son of P.F. Strawson, who was a pretty famous philosopher in the 20th century, who also kind of wrote on this free will and moral responsibility debate. Galen Strawson's father is famous for arguing that, look, the way our society is set up and the way that our psychology and biology is set up is that we have these attitudes and reactions to things in life, what he called reactive attitudes. And these aren't things that we can get rid of. Consequently, we make judgments about whether something is right or wrong, whether or not someone should do something or not do something. And this is so ingrained as a part of our human experience that there's no getting rid of this. We're kind of stuck with thinking that free will exists and organizing our society around that concept. Well, as we'll see, Galen Strawson does not take the same position of his father. A British philosopher who is currently, I believe, at the University of Texas. He's going to provide a few different arguments as to why he doesn't think free will exists, why he doesn't even think it's possible in the first place. And as we'll see, he thinks this debate has kind of run its course. He thinks that the two sides of this debate keep talking past one another. They refuse to cede any ground. And he thinks that instead of having this discussion, we should kind of just learn more about human psychology, because that is what is going to actually allow us to influence people to do good things and be good people. He's written on a lot of different topics as well, including the philosophy of mind, the works of Kant and Locke and Hume. But today we're looking at one specific piece, Luck Swallows Everything. And as we go through his argument, I'm going to read a quote for you eventually, and we're going to formalize it. Reflect on whether or not you think it's a good argument or not. So I asked you at the beginning of class, do you think free will exists? Why or why not? If it does, in what situations do we have it? In what situations do we not? Well, it's kind of hard to have this discussion unless we're all on the same page about what free will is, right? If we all have different definitions, how are we going to come to a conclusion about it and communicate? So I'm going to start today by giving you some helpful definitions that will help us frame the discussion. I'm going to introduce two terms for y'all right here, and then we're going to go over some positions on this debate. The first definition I want to give you is that of determinism. This is a word you might see thrown around in the philosophical literature. Determinism is a particular view on how things happen in reality, you could say. It is the view that, quoting Strawson, everything that happens in the universe is necessitated by what has already gone before, in such a way that nothing can happen otherwise than it does. So can somebody rephrase this? What do you think he means by this? What is meant by this word determinism? Somebody give it their best shot. Yeah.
The past impacts the future, so it's just what happened before impacts now.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. You could think of a helpful image, a line of dominoes to help you to understand this view. The view basically says what's happening now is because of what happened previously. What's going to happen in the future is because of what's happening now, which is because of what's happened previously. Similarly, whether or not this domino in the chain is going to fall is going to be determined by what has gone before it, what has happened. In other words, what this view is trying to get across is the universe that we live in seems to operate according to certain rules and principles. This is what we would call the laws of nature, for example. Right? If I drop something, it's always going to fall to the earth every time. Like charges, like if you have two electrons, they're going to repel each other. Or if you have an electron and a proton, they're always going to attract each other. This is how things work. But more specifically, the reason why things are the way they are today is because of what has happened before and how that stuff was. What this view kind of implies is if we knew exactly what the initial conditions were like for our universe, where the particles and the waves were, what their properties were, all that stuff, we could in principle predict how that would unfold, what would happen, and what might happen in the future. In other words, there's kind of one way that things are going to go based on what's going on. Does that make sense? Another way that you could think about it is like this. We talk about things like choice, like choosing, like free will. When we say things like, I had a choice between the mac and cheese for lunch or the burger, what you're saying is that there were two options in front of you, and you could freely decide which one you were going to go with. Kind of like if there were two paths in front of you, and you could decide which one you wanted to walk down. Right? Determinism says, in actuality, there are not two paths. There's one way things are going to go because of how things were like in the past, because of how things are like right now. In other words, what determinism would seem to imply is that, well, the choice that you were going to make for lunch, for example, was already predetermined. It's based on your wants and your needs and the biochemical reactions that are going on in your brain and all that stuff. To sum up, what determinism is trying to get across is, look, there's one way that things are going to go based on the laws of nature, based on how things are, based on what has happened in the past. Make sense? This is basically a view that a lot of contemporary scientists think is very well supported by our understanding of the universe. Things are going to behave in similar ways because there seem to be rules and principles baked into the structure of reality. We can't go faster than the speed of light. I can't flap my arms really fast and fly like a bird. Okay, I don't have that ability. This is what determinism is trying to get across. Now, this raises an obvious question. If there's one way that things are going to go, based on what has happened before and how things were and how things are now, does anybody have any free will or free choice? Or are all our thoughts and actions predetermined? necessitated, you could say. Well, it depends on what you mean by free will, right? And this is another difficult concept to talk about because it seems like everybody has a different definition. And you'll see if you read into this literature that the different sides on this debate, whether or not free will exists, seem to have different definitions. So what I'm going to provide for you here is very vague, very loose, very general. But basically, I think what people mean by free will is this: having the ability to choose what one thinks or does. Is that kind of what you mean by free will? If you say, I have free will, are you saying, yeah, I have choices before me, and I can determine the choice I make? Is that kind of what you mean? I could choose the mac and cheese or the burger. I could have chosen to go to, University of Minnesota instead of Seton Hill. I could have chosen to live in a different dorm, but I chose this one, right? Yeah, I think that's kind of what people mean by free will. That's kind of our colloquial understanding of it. What it implies is that we have some sort of capacity or ability to choose between genuine options. There are genuine options before us, and we're not forced to choose one or the other. We can decide. Well, that's one way of defining free will. If you start thinking about this topic in relation to moral responsibility, whether or not people are responsible for their actions, sometimes people define free will in this way, which is even a vaguer definition: that which is required for moral responsibility. And you kind of already intuitively have this view. If I plant a mind control device inside your head that makes you raise your arm, or makes you reach out and touch things, or makes you walk a certain way, and you run into somebody and knock them down because I pressed a button, would you say you're morally responsible for that? I see y'all shaking your heads. Why not? You didn't do it? Say more. Okay, so you didn't have control over your actions, right? You didn't have control over your body. Yeah, it seems like what we mean by free will as well is something like having control over what we do. And that's kind of what this second definition is trying to get across as well. In order to be morally responsible for things, we generally believe that you had to have been in control of what you were doing. If you weren't in control of what you were doing, we don't think it's right to blame you or say that you're morally responsible. Although maybe there are some exceptions. Yeah.
So how does that, when people are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, you could argue that as well, I guess. They're not under free will, they're being controlled by something. That doesn't make any sense because they decided to take that stuff. You know what I mean?
Well, what you just said seems to be what people will say, right, in response to that. So, okay, let's say your boyfriend cheats on you while he's blackout drunk. And all your friends are like, he couldn't help it, he was blackout. And what are you going to say? He chose to drink. He should have known that that's a dangerous situation. Duh, why would you do that? That's stupid. He chose to get that drunk, right? So when we have these discussions about moral responsibility, oftentimes what comes up is people will say, well, there was a previous point in time where they did have control. And so we can praise or blame them for their action based on that. What do you think? Do y'all agree with that? Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So this whole discussion of whether or not free will exists, and thus whether we think people are morally responsible for what they do, are going to be informed by these definitions. And these definitions are going to come up a lot in our discussion today. So it's good that you will understand them. Now, obviously, people have different beliefs about this. Some people think we have free will. Some people think we don't. Some people think free will is impossible. Some people think our will is constrained, but it's enough to call people morally responsible. Some people think it's a case-by-case basis. Well, there are different positions on this. And more specifically, different positions on whether or not determinism and free will are compatible. So that's where I would like to start. Strawson goes through this in the article. One of the things that he tries to do early on is we'll provide an overview of the free will debate as it's been going on for hundreds of years, as it stands right now. He provides a few different views on this topic. On one side of the debate, you have the incompatibilists. Incompatibilism is the view that determinism and free will are incompatible. In other words, both of them can't be true. If one of them is true, then that implies something about the other, you might say. So the incompatibilists are going to say, if determinism is true, then we don't have free will. Or they might say, free will exists, so determinism is not true. There are two different positions you could take on this, right? Just because you're an incompatibilist doesn't necessarily tell anybody whether or not you believe free will exists. This is a position about the relationship between determinism and free will. On one side of the incompatibilist camp, you have the hard determinists. A lot of scientists, I think, are hard determinists. They think that physics and chemistry and biology, all of that stuff points to the idea that we are natural creatures made of atoms, and because of the way that the universe works and the rules and principles that are baked into it, there's one way that things are going to go based on what has happened before and what things were like in the past. So they're going to say, look, according to our best scientific theories, it seems like determinism is true. Consequently, nobody has free will. There isn't such a thing as genuine choice. You think you have a choice between what to eat for lunch. You think you have a choice about where to sit. But what has happened in the past and what your current mental states and biological states are like are going to determine where you sit. They're going to determine what you eat for lunch. They're going to determine when you go to bed. Everything. So the hard determinists think free will does not exist. There's one way that things are going to go. You might think you have choice. You might think you can actually choose what path to go down, but there are not multiple paths. There's one path. That view of yourself is just an illusion. You don't actually have free will. Okay, so that's one side. What is the other side going to say? What's the flip side of this?
Determinism is false, free will doesn't exist.
Exactly, yeah. The people who hold this position would be called libertarians. Not political libertarians, but metaphysical libertarians. Libertarianism is basically the opposite view from hard determinism. The libertarians are going to say Determinism is false. That's not how our universe works. Free will does actually exist. You have the ability to make real choices in your life. There are real options in front of you. You're not forced to eat the nasty sandwich in the shoe cafeteria. You can order takeout. You can cook something yourself. You can grab the sandwich and throw it at people and be like, "Oh, eat this lunch." I think that you actually have real choice. There are genuine options in front of you. You have free will. And you can exercise that. So if we compare these positions to the images, again, the hard determinists are going to say, look, there's one way things are going to go. There are not multiple paths or options before you. And the libertarian is going to say, no, like, you actually do have genuine choice. Things are not predetermined. You can decide how you want to live. In many cases, perhaps the majority of cases. So, let's just take a poll before we continue on. Anybody here think they're a hard determinist? You think free will doesn't exist? Okay, anybody think they're a libertarian? Okay, a lot more hands. Interesting. Okay, cool. Well, incompatibilism is not the only thing that you might believe in. There's a whole flip side to this as well. Can you guess what that's called? Compatibilism. Exactly. There are some people who think that, look, both can be true. Determinism can be true, and free will can exist. These things are not mutually exclusive. That's what compatibilism would say. They're relying on perhaps a slightly different definition of free will than the incompatibilists. What the compatibilists would say is, look, what we mean by free will is not that you can do whatever the hell you want. Again, you can't just start running on water and run across the lake. You are constrained by what you are like, what your body is like, the laws of nature and that stuff. But more specifically, it doesn't matter if determinism is true or not. In the way that we colloquially understand and use the term, people have free will. Or they have the kind of free will that we care about, that we would want to invoke if we're trying to justify punishing people or rewarding them or whatever else. So, you could say the compatibilists don't have as strong or radical a conception of free will as the libertarians. Maybe a weaker, less radical understanding of what this term actually means. And consequently, they're going to say, it doesn't matter. Both can be true. So we've seen a few different positions so far. We've seen incompatibilism and compatibilism. And in the incompatibilist camp, you could either think free will doesn't exist, you could be a hard determinist, or you could be a libertarian and think free will does exist. What's another position you might have on this? What is Strawson's position? Does anybody remember from the text? I hinted at it earlier when I described what his view was. Nobody remembers? Y'all got to take notes. when you do your readings. His view is known as pessimism. This is another view you could have about this whole thing. Or, as my undergraduate advisor used to call it when I used to go to college many years ago, no free will either way-ism. It doesn't matter if determinism is true or not. Free will is impossible. And free will doesn't exist, consequently. It doesn't matter if determinism is true or determinism is not true. Free will is not something that could exist as we understand it. One way that you could think about it is like this. And I think this will land for y'all because a lot of you raised your hands when I asked you if you thought free will existed. If determinism is true, if there's only one way things can go, does it seem like you could have free will in such a universe? Determinism would seem to imply there's only one way things are going to go. There aren't actually genuine options in front of you. That would just be an illusion that you have choice. So, a lot of people think, look, if determinism is true, that rules out the possibility of free will. Well, let's look at the flip side. What if our universe was not deterministic? What if our universe is what some thinkers might call indeterministic? There aren't certain rules and laws and principles baked into the fabric of reality that are determining how things are going to go. Sometimes things just happen randomly or by chance for no reason. What if our universe was like that? If it was indeterministic, do you think we could have free will? A lot of people are going to say no. Why? Well, if what you do is just random, if it's just a matter of chance, you don't have control over that, right? And if you don't have control over that, that would seem to imply that in an indeterministic universe, you wouldn't be able to have free will either. This is what the pessimist is going to say. They're going to say, look, if determinism is true, that seems to rule out free will. But on the flip side, if our universe is not deterministic, that also seems to rule out free will. Because if your actions are random, well, how could you have control over them? Right? If the choice that you make is random, it's not produced by you, but just like, oh, it just happens. How could you have free will in a universe like that? And this is the position that Strawson is going to take. He's going to say it doesn't matter if determinism is true or not. It doesn't seem like free will could exist. Thus, free will does not exist. And I think he provides a very strong, interesting argument for this. The kind of argument that he is going to provide is one that discusses, well, how actions come about, how our actions are produced. What would have to be required in order for us to be morally responsible for our actions? I believe he talks through this on pages 4 and 5 in this piece. What he's going to argue is that free will is an impossibility. And that implies something a little scary. Because free will is an impossibility, that means nobody is ultimately morally responsible for anything that they do. So as we go through his argument in the next few minutes, try to see if it has any weaknesses. Try to see if you believe in free will, if you can rescue it from the clutches of his argument. Okay? Because I think his argument is a good one. And if it's true that we don't have free will, and thus we're not morally responsible for anything, that's going to have some very strange implications for how we're doing things, whether or not we should be doing them that way, how we should organize ourselves socially and politically. Okay, you ready to get into it? I'll start with a quote. One way of setting out the pessimist's argument is as follows. When you act, you do what you do in the situation in which you find yourself because of the way that you are. But then to be truly or ultimately morally responsible for what you do, you must be truly or ultimately responsible for the way that you are, at least in crucial mental respects. Obviously, you don't have to be responsible for your height, age, sex, and so on. But you can't be ultimately responsible for the way that you are in any respect at all. So you can't be ultimately responsible for what you do. Why? Well, to be ultimately responsible for the way that you are, you must have somehow intentionally brought it about. You are the way that you are. But there's a problem with this. Suppose you have somehow intentionally brought it about that you are the way that you are now, in certain crucial mental respects. Suppose you have brought it about that you have a certain mental nature Z in such a way that you can be said to be ultimately responsible for Z. For this to be true, you must already have had a certain mental nature Y, in light of which you brought it about that you now have the mental nature Z. If you didn't already have a mental nature, then you didn't have any intentions or preferences and can't be responsible for the way that you are now, even if you have changed. But then, for it to be true that you are ultimately responsible for how you now are, you must be ultimately responsible for having had that nature Y, in the light of which you brought it about that you now have Z. But do you see the issue here? So you must have brought it about that you had Y. But then you must have existed already with a prior mental nature X, in the light of which you intentionally brought it about that you had Y, in the light of which you brought it about that you now have Z, and so on. Here one is setting off on a potentially infinite regress. In other words, in order for one to be truly or ultimately responsible for how one is, in such a way that one can be truly responsible for what one does, something impossible has to be true. There has to be, but cannot be, a starting point in the series of acts of bringing it about that one has a certain nature. A starting point that constitutes an act of ultimate self-origination. So, can y'all grasp what he's trying to get at here or no? Allow me to rephrase it. You have certain feelings and desires right now, right? Certain emotions, certain hopes and dreams. You are a certain way right now. Well, in order to be morally responsible for what you do, you have to have caused the way that you are that produces your actions. So the reason why you do what you do is because of the way that you are. So to be responsible for what you do, you have to be responsible for what you are. But you can't be ultimately responsible for what you are. You didn't bring yourself into existence. You didn't decide to have the genes that you did. You couldn't decide when you were born, where you were born, what family you were born into, what values you were going to have, what your education is going to be like, what your age, sex, race, gender, height, what all that stuff is. You don't have any control over that stuff. Well, maybe a little bit of control, but... Thus, what he's saying is, what you do now is because of the way that you are now. To be ultimately responsible for the way that you are now, you must have been ultimately responsible for what you started out as. But you can't do that. You can't be the cause of yourself. You couldn't bring yourself into existence intentionally with a certain nature. That would lead you to who you are now and what you do now. So maybe this formalization will help. In order to be morally responsible, an agent must be responsible for what they do. So far, so good? This makes sense, right? However, in order for an agent to be responsible for what they do, they must be the cause of their own mental states, which produce their actions. Psychological states, all that stuff. But no one can be the ultimate cause of their own mental states, because no one can be the ultimate cause of who or what they are. He calls this causa sui. Nothing can be causa sui, or the cause of itself. Fancy Latin phrase. Thus, no one can be ultimately responsible for what they do. Why? You do what you do because of the way that you are. You did not and could not logically be ultimately responsible for the way that you are now. So what do you think of this argument? Is it a good one? You're like, I don't know, it seems a little fishy. Well, which of these premises would you disagree with? Do you think that you don't do what you do because of the way that you are? It seems ridiculous to deny that, right?
I see what he's talking about, because again, like where you grow up around, where you surround yourself can be who you are. But like when you're saying like the way you were born, like exactly where you were born, that can't really alter like you, if that makes sense. So I kind of disagree with 4 when it says no one can be the ultimate cause of who they are. Because yes, some things that may have happened can develop who you are, but you are your own person, so you kind of have to make your own like decisions. Hence why I still feel like this argument of there's no free will kind of, to me, contradicts, because you do, in my opinion, I think you do have free will, and how like you are in the world is kind of up to you, not like what your past is.
That's something that a lot of people want to believe, right? What the kind of explanation I provided was something of an oversimplification. Because the problem that he's trying to get at is it gets to that, right? It gets to nature and nurture, but it's deeper than that. The reason, he's going to say, the reason you're doing what you're doing now is because of the way that your mind is right now. Thus, in order to be responsible for what you do now, you had to have had control over the way your mind is now. But, in order to be responsible for the way that your mind is now, you had to have brought it about that your mind was a certain way that caused the way that your mind is now. And he thinks that this leads to an infinite regress. Because you can't ultimately say the second that you come into existence, you don't have control over the way that your mind is or the kind of thing that you are. And you couldn't. To think that you could, you would have to think something like, what you are is an immaterial thing outside of the laws of nature and outside of physics and chemistry and biology, and you can intervene in nature whenever you want. And he thinks that this view is ridiculous. Of course, this is going to be downstream of your metaphysical views, though, right? If you're a dualist like Descartes, and you think there is a difference in kind between the mind and the body, or if you think you have some sort of immaterial soul, that might lead you to believe that you do have free will, right? Because you think a part of you is, well, it's not the same stuff as this. A part of you is not determined by what's going on in your brain. A part of you is not subject to the laws of biology and chemistry and physics. But if you hold, for example, the contemporary scientific view, that all you are is just an amalgamation of atoms and molecules, how could you have control over anything? After all, atoms are just going to do what atoms do based on electromagnetic fields and what has happened in the past and the kinds of atoms they are like and all their properties, right? So I suppose one thing that you could say in order to sidestep this argument is, yeah, I disagree with this because somehow, even though it is a little weird, somehow we can just intervene in what's going on and we're outside of what's going on out in nature in some sense. Or maybe you would say, I don't think that what I'm doing now is caused by my mental states. I think something else is going on. Then you'd have to provide some sort of explanation or story for that. But so do you see the problem he's laying out here? He's trying to say, if you're going to be responsible for anything, you had to have brought it about that you are the kind of thing you are. But that's impossible. So you're not morally responsible for anything. Nobody is. What we have is just an illusion of choice. An illusion of moral responsibility. Is anybody persuaded by this? Or do you think it's a good argument? Yeah?
I agree with some of it. I agree with number one and number two because, like I said before, you're morally responsible for your actions because of your free will. Joe, like, no one's forcing you to do anything sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to see where this argument goes wrong. One seems to make sense, right? Basically what it's saying is in order to be morally responsible, you have to have some control over what you do. Okay, so far so good. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But maybe some of y'all disagree with too. Maybe you don't think that what you are determines what you do. Although to reject that kind of seems crazy, right? Because doesn't what everything does, isn't it determined by the kind of thing that it is? I don't know, but maybe you could reject too. Yeah. What were you going to say?
I was just gonna say, like be the cause of their own mental states. Like in like court cases, like some people can like plead that they're like mentally ill.
Yeah.
They didn't have a choice of what they were doing. So like going like based off that, like maybe like how would he respond, or like going by free will, like does our general public believe in free will? That's why some people can believe that they are mentally ill and get out of the case.
Yeah.
Others can't.
Yeah, I think the general public believes that people have free will. I think he would say the same, right? He would just say they're mistaken, you know. But yeah, that is a deeply held belief that we have in society, right? Because we do reward and punish people for what they do. And you and your friends say stuff all the time like, you shouldn't do that, or you should really study. To use any word like should or ought seems to imply that somebody has a choice, right? So it's almost as if, in our way of thinking and acting, we seem to presuppose that free will exists, right? Our criminal justice system is based on this idea. In fact, a lot of how we do things and how we think about things is based on the idea that free will exists. Because we think free will exists, we think people are morally responsible for what they do. Because we think free will exists, we think it's justified to punish people and reward others. Because we think free will exists, we make all these claims and judgments about people. Right? You should do this, you shouldn't do this, I shouldn't have done that, he should have done that. Because we think free will exists, we tell people that they should be rational. Right? We say, think rationally, be logical about this. Well, in order for somebody to be that way intentionally, they have to have a choice to think that way. Right? But maybe this will shed some light on the matter. Do you think that depending on the situation, people have more or less free will? What do you think? Do you have more or less free will than someone perhaps with a debilitating mental illness? Do you have more or less free will than somebody who is being mind controlled? Right? Say I'm an expert neurosurgeon. I put some stuff in one of your brains. Would you say that you have more free will than that person that I'm controlling? It becomes tricky when we start to talk about cases like this, because the world is gray. It's not obvious. A lot of people are going to say it's based on a case-by-case basis. Whether or not we judge people for their actions, whether or not we think what they did was wrong or right, or whether or not we think we can praise or blame them. Sitting here, do you think you have free will? Yeah, you can choose to walk out of the room, right? You can choose to stay. You can choose to watch Netflix on your computer instead of taking notes. Yeah, it certainly seems that way, right? So it would seem that when we consider ourselves and other normal everyday people, we think that we and others have free will. But it becomes more complicated once you start looking at people's education, the society in which they live, their mental states, their illnesses and disabilities, and things like that. Say, for example, you know somebody that is addicted to meth. Does that person have free will to do or not do meth? What do you think? Should they be blamed for giving into the temptation and doing meth?
before they had free will, but after they kind of relinquished their ability to have free will because there's something controlling them after the fact.
Something controlling them. What would that something be?
So like once they take it, then they have that addiction to methamphetamines. They would want that, so that would overtake like your basic like needs.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, one way that you could describe this is like neurologically, right? You could say, yeah, what addiction does to you is, well, when you're addicted to something, there is some sort of neural structure in your brain that causes you to have certain desires and urges and pushes you in a direction, right? Maybe overrides a lot of other things. So you would say that somebody has the free will to do or not do meth, but then when you're too far down that path, you might be stuck.
Yeah, because everything would be related to that. Like, because you would try to like fit that need. You know what I mean? Like people who are addicted to that, like steal from their families, which they normally maybe wouldn't before.
Yeah.
Switches who you are.
Yeah. Yeah. Do the rest of y'all agree? Or no? Let's say your brother is addicted to heroin, and he starts stealing your stuff to pay for his heroin habit. Is it right for you to judge and blame him for that and tell him, what you're doing is fucked up. Stop it. What do you think?
I think even though like somebody might still be further down that path and very addicted, I think there's still a chance like you still have the ability to stop if you want to. Like it might be more difficult than like somebody who doesn't do it at all or just started, but I think you still have the ability.
Okay, so you think they still have the ability to say no and to stop. So, yeah, that we judge and blame them is justifiable. Because they still have that ability? Yeah? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I feel like you do have the right to judge them, even though, I mean, I feel like their addiction is kind of taking over them. Like, you still have to be like, that's like fucked up. Like, you can't just take my stuff for money.
Yeah.
Like, you should tell them that it's wrong, even though it's not necessarily like, it's like their compulsions because of the addiction to take your stuff, but they still, that's a choice for them to make.
Okay, so you also think that, look, even though they have this addiction, they still have a choice. Like they can choose to steal or not.
Yeah, I think like it's a hard, like it's a complicated choice to like not like to, I don't even know if I want to call it a choice to like keep taking the meth, but like to steal or heroin, whatever you said it was.
Yeah.
But like to steal, that's a choice, in my opinion, I guess.
Okay. What about in cases of mental illness? Are you or does somebody you know, do they have extreme depression? And it's very difficult for them to get up and clean their room and just leave their room or get out of their bed? What do you think about somebody like that? Can you judge or blame them for not seeking help or doing something about it? Or is that callous? Is that mean?
I wouldn't really say like blame them for it, but like I'll tell them like you know something's wrong, and the fact that you're not seeking help is not good. Like that's a problem within itself.
Okay, so you would say like, look, you should be doing this.
Like if you know something's wrong with you, like really wrong with you, and you can't like get out of your bed, and you don't have the energy. Oh shit, my bad. You don't have the energy to clean your room and stuff like that. Like it's like you can't do it, and that happens all the time. You need to seek help. So you can find get the energy to do things that you want to do and not just be sitting in your bed all day not doing productive.
So would you say, let's say you're going out of town for a week and your depressed friend offers to take care of your cat, and you come back from being out of town and they let your cat die because they couldn't get out of bed and didn't feed your cat. Would you say like they are to blame? Like, that's messed up. They had a choice. Yeah.
I wouldn't be in that situation because I know you're depressed.
Well, it might be a stupid thing to do, but.
Like, I know you don't do nothing all day. Like, I wouldn't, like, put you in charge of anything that's mine. Like, you're not responsible enough to do it. You can't even take care of, like, yourself in the meantime. I'm not going to put something else on you.
Yeah. No, I mean, I also would not ask that person to take care of my cat, but. Does it depend on what the addiction or mental illness is? Let's speak into that a little bit then. What about somebody who is bipolar and they're manic in some instances, depressive in other instances, and they lash out at you? What do you think about that?
I think that like taking into like what they're going through is like hard and that it's important to have empathy, but there does come a point where like you have to have like standards and like they have to like be people too. Like I understand that like it might take over them, but like there are consequences to their actions, whether they're fully in control or not.
Okay, so what I got from what you're saying is like you can't just excuse everything that they do.
Like it's an explanation, but it's not an excuse.
Ah, yes. Yes, I understand what you mean. What about somebody with schizophrenia? Can they be blamed for their actions, for hurting people? Should they be given a pass? Somebody who experiences visual or auditory hallucinations, and they're like, later, yeah, I attacked you because I thought you were a dragon. What do you think? Yeah.
I think it kind of depends, because depending on like the level of schizophrenia, like on how you interact with them can kind of set them off in a way. You know, like you kind of have to be aware, because that can be on you and what you say to them. So like I dealt with somebody that like if you spoke to them a certain way, so if you like kind of made their visions like true in a way, they started to go up and up and up, and then it would get worse, and then they'd start kind of like getting annoyed and frustrated. Or if you told them they were wrong as well, like that would frustrate them. Like you're not seeing anything, so how can you do this? You're setting them off yourself. That's kind of on you instead of them.
Okay.
You know who you're working with.
So if you end up triggering them, for lack of a better word, you're at least causally responsible partly for what they do.
Yeah.
Maybe morally responsible. Maybe. Okay, so it seems like y'all are saying it depends on the severity. It depends on what the person is dealing with. Depends on the situation. It's context dependent. What about people who are raised in a cult? Let's say your friend grew up in a cult that lives in the woods, and they have a particular view of the world. They were raised into having this view. They were sheltered from the outside world. They don't know anything else. And they're very critical of your lifestyle and your beliefs. And they're always talking to you about that. And perhaps they're mean to other people that don't share the same beliefs that they have. Are they morally responsible for what they do as a result of their beliefs?
Yeah, because they have the choice to kind of like experience different things, and like you said, they criticize you for everything that you do, instead of just being like open-minded and seeing like what life is outside the cult. It's kind of their fault, but I've also never been in a cult, so I don't know. Like, what's the?
Hopefully, yeah. Can we ever be sure? I don't know. That's a different question. Yes.
I think like the word morally, like that whole idea can mean something different to everyone. Like definitely, like when you think about cultures and everything too. I guess you could call like a cult their own culture. But if like I feel like we're just thinking about us in the U.S. Like even though we were talking about mental illness, but if you just think about like any other country or like a third world country that's suffering, they can't get help for their mental illness. So like that whole morally thing, I don't know how I feel about that word. Because like morally could be something to everyone. So like what is morally?
Well, this is actually something that we're going to investigate thoroughly in our second unit. Is there an objective standard of right and wrong? If there is, what makes something an action right or wrong? Because there are certain pros and cons for no matter what side of the debate that you come down on that. For example, if you think morality is relative just to the culture that you live in, there is no objective standard, then you have no justifiable basis for criticizing other cultures. Because it's right for them, right? But there are certain things that we would object to. Female genital mutilation, for example. Human rights abuses. But that's something that we will talk about another time. So, it sounds like you were saying they have the potential to access other worldviews and other information. So because they have that ability, maybe they are morally responsible for being stuck in their beliefs? Or do you think that that's not right? What do you think? Yeah.
I see like both perspectives of it, like that they do have like the moral compass to be able to like get out of it, but also like they don't, if you're growing up in a cult in the woods, like do they even know anything about like the outside world? Like,
well, right, yeah.
Like do like he said like open-minded, but like what are they open-minded to if they know nothing else? Like if they know nothing else besides them what they're living in, then they are gonna think that everything they're doing is right.
Right.
So,
it's like the people in the cave.
Yeah.
Right? All they knew were the shadows on the wall. It's the same for people who grow up in a particular environment. Right? They're conditioned into having certain beliefs and values. And if they never leave that community, either mentally or physically, like they won't know anything else. Right? So, can they be held morally responsible? Maybe we give some of them a pass, depending on the severity, depending on if we think they're brainwashed. Right? That's a term people throw around a lot. Okay, so maybe our answer to this is the same as this one. It depends. I don't know. Think about this stuff because it's very thorny. It's very tricky. I think most of y'all would agree, right, that people who are mind controlled are not morally responsible for what they do. I'm controlling your actions because I put some stuff in your brain, right? So, just think about this stuff. People have different views on this. It's not obvious. Now, I'd like to end by just going over one more thing. Strawson argues in this piece that free will is an impossibility. Consequently, he thinks that nobody's ultimately morally responsible for what they do. What else would that imply? If free will doesn't exist, what else would that imply? We've talked a little bit about it already, or at least I have. Yeah?
Is it that our lives are predetermined?
You could say that. Yeah, some people do believe that, right? Yeah, that they don't have any real choices. That, yeah, there's one way their life is going to go, and they're stuck on that track. Yeah? What else? Think about what we do in society, the kinds of institutions and practices that we have and engage in. If free will doesn't exist, what might we have to reform about our society? Okay. Maybe there's a worry of homogenization or something. Okay.
If free will doesn't exist, then our laws are basically meaningless because we don't have the ability to choose our actions, so therefore why would we be punished for something we couldn't really choose to do?
Ah, there's the point, right? Yeah, that's a good one. If free will doesn't exist and nobody's ultimately responsible for what they do, how is it justifiable to punish people? how is it justifiable to put them in prison? If they didn't have control over what they did. That guy who killed 7 people brutally, if he doesn't have free will, he didn't have a choice in doing that. So how can we blame him for that? How can we punish him? One thinker has gone so far to argue that because free will does not exist, we are obligated to engage in what he calls punishment. It's no criminal's fault that they are where they are, or that they did what they did. Consequently, we should reform our prisons so that they have Xboxes and TVs and nice couches and smoothies and ice cream. Why? It's just unlucky that they did bad stuff that made them end up there. So we should try to make prison as fun and comfortable as possible. What do you think about this view? Is it crazy? Can you see why it would follow, though, from somebody thinking free will doesn't exist? If it's nobody's fault that they ended up there, how is it acceptable that they live in these poor conditions, without amenities, without things? It's something you may want to think about. It's interesting, right? In a lot of the major religions around the world, there is this idea of the afterlife, of judgment, depending on how you lived your life, what you believe in. It depends on what denomination or religion you're looking at. If free will doesn't exist, is it fair for God to send people to hell? Or to send people to heaven? If free will doesn't exist, is it justifiable that people may end up in purgatory? It would seem like a lot of our major religions depend on the idea that humans have a choice in what they do. And it's their choices that end up determining where they're going to end up. So if you don't think free will exists, you might have a bone to pick with a lot of the religions. Right? Because you're like, nobody can choose to be better. Nobody can choose not to sin. It's not a thing. And finally, if you don't think free will exists, it doesn't seem like you have any justifiable basis for saying people should be or think rationally. Why? Well, to say, Sarah, you should be rational here, seems to imply that she can choose to think rationally. Right? But if free will doesn't exist, whether or not somebody thinks rationally or not is just chance. It's random. It's just a happy accident. These are some of the things that we might have to rethink or give up if we come to the conclusion that free will does not exist. Do I think anybody knows for sure? No. It certainly seems like we have free will, right? You can choose to look at me and listen to me or not. It seems like you can choose to open the door or not. It seems like you can choose to skip class or not. So it seems like we're stuck with this experience. Whether or not it really exists is not something I think we're ever going to be able to prove. But it's worth reflecting on. Because again, what you believe makes up the stuff in the universe and how we got here is going to influence whether or not you think you have free will. And that's going to influence what you think our politics should be. Whether you think we should have a criminal justice system. Whether you think we should be tough on crime or not. So what I hope to have convinced you of at the end of this unit is, I know the stuff that we're talking about is abstract, but your basic metaphysical and epistemological beliefs are going to inform everything else that you believe. Whether you're a progressive or a conservative, whether you're a libertarian, whether you're a communist, whether or not you think people have free will, are morally responsible, and all the rest. So think about this stuff. Talk about this stuff with your friends and family members. Okay, anybody have any final questions, comments, concerns? Okay, thank you very much.